Okay, we're going to look at the 14th century, all this kind of leading up to the Renaissance, and trying to understand what Europe is like at the end of the what we term the Middle Ages or the medieval period. So the 1300s and kind of all the chaos that is around at that time. And so we'll start by looking at the social economic disasters and then looking at the Black Death and how those kind of ravaged through European society, which eventually ends up setting up Europe for the Renaissance. So we'll get there eventually, but for now we're going to look at the social and cultural consequences of these disasters and Black Death. To get there, we first should look and understand medieval social structure. So there's kind of essentially, well, there's a few classes, but most people are living down here in this lowest class of peasants and serfs. And serfs are mostly in Eastern Europe, although some in Western Europe, but it's basically the peasant class. And those are the absolute poor farmers who are living on their lands of the lords and the vassals, and basically engaging in sustenance farming. So they're farming, everything that they grow is going to their local lord, and they don't get to keep anything. So life is pretty miserable for that group of people. Within cities, you have merchants and craftsmen, and then you have some independent farmers who actually own the land they're on and are not just renting from nobles. And those are very rare, but all of these are kind of making up the lower class. Above that, you have the nobility. So you have at the very top a king, and then his nobles and knights and vassals. And all of these people would have various tracts of land, some larger than others, some very small, but nonetheless, by having that land and by having a title, they are kind of higher up in the hierarchy of medieval social society. And so that sets them above. They employ these peasants and serfs to work their lands, to produce goods for them, in turn paying taxes to the people above them, whether that's the nobleman, whether that's the king, or if you are the king, and even the nobles and the knights are paying everything else to the Pope or the church in general. And they kind of stand outside. So they have their own hierarchy of the clergy, and we'll look at that a little bit later, but they stand outside the normal political structure as their own entity, and really in a way stand above it, where the kings and the noblemen are subservient to the church, to their local bishop, and to the Pope, and that's due to fear of being excommunicated and spending all of eternity in hell. So this is kind of the medieval social structure. In terms of political structure at this time, we have generally decentralized government. So on the last slide, we saw that, yes, there are kings and queens, mostly kings in this era, but they have very little power. There are no standing armies at this point, so in order for them to raise an army, they rely on on the noblemen and the knights and the vassals who've all pledged allegiance to them. So we have really, really decentralized governments. You have even fortified towns that stand alone. When we get to Renaissance Italy, we'll see that these small Italian communes and cities stand alone as independent political entities. You do have the Holy Roman Empire, although that's so subdivided with so many princes and different dukes and vassals that it's really hard to call that a centralized government. The first area we'll kind of get to that in is going to be in Spain, and we'll get to that a little bit later when we get to Ferdinand and Isabella. So you have very much decentralized system. Feudalism is the dominant system, where you have feudal order. The king is the king, and he has a series of noblemen who have pledged allegiance and loyalty to him, and they in turn have a series of knights who have pledged loyalty to them, and all of them have peasants and serfs working under them in order to produce the money and goods and that they need to survive and to get wealthy. And so this feudal system it works. It's certainly not efficient. It's definitely not the best thing, but it works in the given time. Contributing to this is you have a really fragmented and chaotic legal system. So there are kind of three concurrent legal systems that exist. You have civil law, so that is what the government says. Whether it's your king, whether it's your the nobleman, the duke who's in charge of you, and sometimes those are two contradictory things. So even within civil law, you have a little bit of chaos, and those are really hard to enforce. there's not good communication. You don't have judges or magistrates in every area. So civil law exists. Whether or not it's actually followed is a whole different question. Then you have canon law, or what is known as church law. And so that's what the church says can or cannot happen. And that's, again, a whole new set of rules. That is more uniform across the board, but again, somewhat hard to enforce, especially when the people who are supposed to enforce it, the priests and the bishops and the cardinals, aren't necessarily following canon law themselves. And then there's custom law, or just local customs, the way things have always been done. And that oftentimes goes in contradiction to the civil law that is asked to be followed by the local king. So you have all of these kind of overlapping systems, and this makes things really confusing and difficult for peasants who are illiterate and uneducated. So they don't really know what to do, they're kind of told what to do, and sometimes that gets them in trouble. At the same time, you have allegiance to both church and state, so you have competing interests between kings and noblemen and bishops, all of whom are competing for worldly power and sometimes working together, but quite often not. And so you have these kind of dual allegiances that sometimes come in conflict. On top of that sort of overarching chaos, in the 1300s there is a period of real problems for European society. And this stems from the bottom note right here. Up until about 1300, there had been really large population growth in Europe. They were coming out of the real dark ages, and population was growing pretty rapidly. There's a number of new cities and towns that are developed. People start moving to them out of the countryside, not at a very large rate, but you begin to see an increasing population. And this creates pressure on the food supply, because as you have more people, they obviously need to eat more, and when a lot of them start living in cities, they are not producing food, but they're still reliant on the people in the countryside to produce the food for them so that they can in fact eat. So this pressure kind of is growing, and it reaches a head in the 1300s and is met with massive problems in two things, and they kind of go hand in hand. And the first is what's known as the Little Ice Age. So there's a pretty drastic drop in average temperatures during the 1300s, and winter comes earlier, it lasts longer, it's more severe, and this obviously is problematic because it causes crop failure, but also you have crop failure, so you have less food, but people are more exposed to the elements, and so those things kind of combine to kill people and make them weaker or less able to survive. And going along with this little ice age comes a real nasty famine. So you have this drop in average temperature, then there's a period of heavy rain which floods the fields, which makes the food basically not grow or inedible if it does grow. Everything is rotting, everything is miserable, and so you have massive food shortages. Despite these food shortages, you still have super high tax rates, so food is not being made, but people are still demanding food taxes be paid, and so there's this struggle to even survive at all. All of this leads to great famine, great suffering, and it creates a population that's really ripe for a massive sickness to wreak havoc upon it. And indeed it does, in the form of the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. It is the most devastating natural disaster in European history. It's really hard to get an estimate for how many people died because population records aren't good, but you can see anywhere from a quarter to a third of the entire population of Europe is killed because of this. Most damage is done, of course, in cities because there's highly concentrated areas there. And so the Black Death, also known as the bubonic plague, is carried on, it's transmitted through fleas that come on rats from the east through these new trade networks that are beginning to open up. And the disease itself is Yersinia pestis, and there's actually two different forms of it, but it comes along these rats and it thrives in really filthy conditions. And European cities in the 1300s are the definition of filthy conditions. You have people crowding, 10 people living in one bedroom. There's no sense of hygiene. There's no plumbing, so people are throwing their waste and their feces and their trash out into the streets. And so it's creating this real breeding ground for this disease to continue, for rats to live and fleas to move along. Also, people aren't bathing, so they're not keeping the fleas off themselves. They're just kind of soaking in these fleas. Um, so you have that going on. There's no sense of personal hygiene. Again, in addition to not bathing, they're not washing their hands, they're not trimming their hair. So you have kind of just this real ripe thing for disaster. The plague, as I mentioned, started in Asia. They think it started somewhere in China, and it slowly makes its way to Europe in 1347, where it arrives. And it makes its way overland through the trade route, but also through the Tartar army is moving through, and it follows the army, as diseases are wont to do. And eventually it makes its way into Europe. It spreads, and in some areas, 50 to 60% of the people die. You see 25 to 50% of the European population is dead within 4 years. That's a huge number of people, and it obviously creates major, like really major social consequences. And the plague returns. It's not just this 4 year from 1347 to 1351. It comes back in 1360s, and it even comes back later in the 1400s, 1500s. It pops up time and again. In fact, the bubonic plague still exists today. Of course, now we have ways to treat it, but there was an outbreak in Yosemite very recently. So this is not something that has disappeared, but it just wreaked absolute havoc on a population that was already weak due to widespread famine and this little ice age and the kind of politically and socially fractured society. So the Black Death came tearing through. And again, you can see here the spread of it, and this will make sense as we get to the Renaissance. It comes from the east along here, along what is known as the Silk Road, and there's armies that are marching through here, as well as now when it gets to the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, through ships that are trading through. And so these ships would land in Italy, and this is another reason why Italy becomes the birthplace of the Renaissance, is because it's this trading hub. And then from there, the disease spreads as it follows the merchants who take it north with them into what is now Switzerland and Germany and France, moving up through the Low Countries, through northern Germany, into England. You see that there are some areas that are spared. Generally, that's where there are no cities. Again, it hits the cities the hardest because there are so many people living in such crowded, filthy areas. And it just wrecks its way through all of Europe and creating havoc along the way. There are many different kind of perceptions of the plague at the time, and it spurs on a lot of different reactions, and none of them are really that great. And so a lot of people initially view this as being a punishment from God for their sinful ways, for the misbehaviors they've done, for the terrible things that they had done. And there's groups that are known as the flagellants, and they go around actually whipping themselves in a way to kind of scourge themselves in this effort to atone for the sins that they believe they're being punished for. And so they go around literally whipping themselves into this frenzy in order to try to make things better, to appease God. There's this real spike in attacks against Jewish people. They are blamed. A lot of people think that the Jewish people have poisoned the wells, and so that's how they're getting sick. There's at this time a real misunderstanding of how the plague is spread. Most people think it's spread through the air, and so that's where you'll see the plague doctor masks, which look like those really long bird beaks that Venetian doctors would often wear. And so there's really not an understanding of how the plague is spread at this time. And so there's also this belief that the Jewish people poisoned the wells. And these stories go way back. During the Crusades, there was belief that the Jewish people poisoned the wells. And so it's just another excuse to attack the Jewish people. And some argue that it was an attack and an effort to steal the wealth of the Jewish population at the time. This just rise in anti-Semitism happens. I should point out that some people did have a better understanding of this Black Death, and that was in Muslim communities in North Africa, the Middle East, and Spain. They had kind of progressed in their scientific knowledge further than Western Europe had, and so they kind of understood the basics of hygiene and had a better understanding and a better way to avoid this disease. And a lot of them started imposing quarantines, which is a term that came out at this time from Genoa, where ships arriving at the city would have to wait for 40 days before they were allowed to come in. And that way they would prevent this disease from spreading. Mass violence also occurred, mostly again against the Jewish people, but they'd also attack other people who they believed were causing this plague, women, elderly women who they perceived as being witches, but also just kind of general food riots and sick riots, and people who are fearful that they were in the end times would often rise up in violence. So you have this time where there's a shortage of food, the weather's shifted, there's kind of all sorts of different political and social alliances going on, and there's massive violence happening as a result of this real devastating disease. And beyond that, we have more social upheavals and economic changes as a result of this. So the labor shortage, when your labor supply dies, when the peasants die, that means that you are short of workers, and there's a drop in demand for agricultural products because there's fewer people to consume the food. That means the aristocrats are starting to make less money. So they based most of their income off of selling goods from the farms that were worked by serfs. You have fewer serfs, so you're producing less, and the things that you've produced are now worth less. You lose a lot of your money. And so people really start to panic about this. The wealthy people start to panic about this. And there are some kind of crazy responses. In England, they passed what's known as the Statute of Laborers, which was an attempt to limit the wages. And it's basically said you cannot get paid any more than you were paid before the plague. And it's an effort, it's not a minimum wage, it's a maximum wage. It's a real effort to keep peasants and serfs in check so that they don't start threatening the wealth of the aristocrats. Obviously, this doesn't work very well. There's really a number of peasant revolts as a result of that in England, but also in France there's the famous Jacquerie, and in Germany there's a series of peasant revolts as well. And we'll look at those later in chapter 12, but it's worth noting that these massive revolts happen. But it's not all bad if you survive the plague, because there's a lot of social mobility and there's a lot of economic mobility and opportunities. Because so many people have died, there's so many new jobs that open up. You have the ability to move to a city and join the blacksmiths guild because half the guild has died and half the families have died, and there's not a lot of young men to replace them. So you have this opportunity to move in there. There's also lots of new economic opportunities. If you were a farmer and your neighbor's family caught the plague and all died, well, who's going to take their land? You have the opportunity to take their land and to grow your kind of wealth and your property. And so there's these new economic opportunities as well. And because of these new economic opportunities, you have this newly wealthy class, and I use the term wealthy and class very loosely right here, but there's really these opportunities for these groups to move up in the social hierarchy. So we see new social opportunities opening up. So if you manage to survive the plague, life gets significantly better for a very short period of time, where you have more food, so you're healthier, you have more jobs, more job opportunities, and you even have the ability to really advocate for yourself, because if you are a farmer or peasant working on one farm for some lord, and all the peasants on the lord next door's farm have died, you can take your services over there and kind of bid yourself out, and the highest bidder can have you, and they don't have much of a choice, because where else are they going to find labor? And so this creates this time of a little bit of social upheaval. It creates a lot of fear and trepidation amongst the wealthy and the elites, because they feel themselves being threatened. And so naturally they push back with things like the Statute of Laborers. So these are some of the things that happen as a result of this Black Death and these other major crises, such as the Great Famine and the Little Ice Age in Europe during the 1300s.